Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight, we journey into fire, iron, and the kind of whisper that doesn't come from mouths. You're standing at the edge of a forge, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, where sparks leap like fireflies and the air hums with a thick, aching heat. The blacksmith wipes soot from his brow, unaware that tonight, something will speak to him from within the molten glow. You probably want to know this. Most people live their entire lives without ever hearing a whisper from a lump of glowing metal. Now, Guy, he didn't even finish school, but the universe doesn't always wait for scholars. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and local time. I love knowing where these sleepy stories are finding their home. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The blacksmith's name was Ferrin, though names mattered little in a village where most people referred to each other by their tools. He was just Smith, the hammer swinger, the horseshoe maker, the soot-smeared fellow in the leather apron. Ferrin didn't mind. He liked his routine: wake before dawn, heat the forge, hammer until his arms trembled, then drink stale beer in the silence of dusk. The kind of life that left little room for magic. But this dusk was different. It was the kind of late summer evening where the air clung to your lungs like damp wool. Ferrin had been working a stubborn ingot of pig iron all day. Too much carbon, maybe, but he'd hammered it thinner and thinner, trying to draw it into shape. He was half drunk on exhaustion, shoulders aching, when the whisper came. It wasn't a voice in the wind. Not really. It came from beneath the roar of the fire, threading between the sizzle of quenching water. A syllable, more vibration than word. It slid past his ears like a tickle on the edge of thought. He looked around. The forge was empty, of course. Shrugging, he turned back to the iron on the anvil. He was about to raise his hammer when the sound came again. Clearer this time, hot enough to shape Ferrin. He froze, hammer halfway up. The voice, if it could be called that, had come from the metal. He was certain. The words hummed through the bar like a plucked string. He dropped the hammer. It clanged against the stone floor, scattering a few startled beetles. Ferrin stumbled back, eyes wide. Was he mad? The heat had gotten to him. Surely. He muttered a curse, then laughed shakily. Iron doesn't talk. And yet, for a long moment, he just stared at the bar, glowing dull orange in the firelight. Nothing happened. No voices. No trickles of ancient secrets, just metal, hot and inert. So he did what most tired men would do, ignored it, picked up his hammer, finished the shoe, and dunked it into the barrel. The next day, the whisper returned. This time, it came earlier, when he was smelting a bundle of scrap into something workable. He was leaning over the crucible when he heard, "Too much manganese, you'll get brittleness." The hair on his neck stood up. That wasn't even a word he used. Or manganese. He'd heard the term once from a passing miner, but it wasn't part of his trade vocabulary. He didn't measure alloys. He went by eye and feel. Yet when he checked the scrap, sure enough, there were strips of a purplish ore known for hardening steel, but making it prone to fracture. He tossed them out and restarted the mix. The final product came out better than anything he'd made in years. He didn't sleep much that night. Now, quick pause for a historical truth. Blacksmiths in medieval Europe didn't often know why certain combinations of metals worked. They relied on passed-down rules like don't mix bog iron with riverstone or hammer until it sings. There were no lab tests, no science books, just sweat and trial, which makes Ferrin's next few days feel, well, impossible. Each morning, the metal whispered new truths. Not commands, just gentle observations, reminders, suggestions. Shift the angle of your hammer, cool it slower, fold it again, and listen this time. And here's where it gets weirder. Ferrin started dreaming in diagrams, geometric shapes of impossible precision, unfolding like petals in his sleep. He'd wake up and sketch them in charcoal on his workshop walls, though he didn't know what they meant. Some said the first compasses in Europe came from the East with the Mongol traders, but historians still argue whether blacksmiths like Ferrin ever saw one. Regardless, he started drawing circles within circles, points aligned like stars. He didn't understand the math, but the metal did. Of course he told no one. The village priest already thought his late-night forging bordered on heresy. The baker joked that Ferrin was half demon, given how often his forge glowed past midnight, and the cobbler's boy whispered that he'd seen Ferrin speaking to sparks. Ferrin began to wonder, had he always heard it, just too distracted to notice? Had the hammer's ring always hidden voices? There's a fringe theory, nowhere near mainstream, that suggests certain frequencies from molten metal can induce auditory hallucinations. Total guesswork, really, but Ferrin might have been the first to live that theory, whether real or not. Still, part of him clung to reason. Maybe it was just his imagination, a mind fried from years of heat and solitude. Maybe it wasn't the metal that had changed. Maybe it was him, but then came the day the iron said his name, and that changed everything. Ferrin stood in the forge, heart thudding in his ears, hands trembling just slightly over the tongs. The ingot before him glowed with a soft cherry hue, not yet ready for the hammer, but pulsing gently, like a breath. And then it came again, quieter, more intimate this time. Ferrin. It was not a thought, not a trick of wind or distant echo. It was the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, knowing his name. He dropped the tongs. They clattered against the dirt floor. This wasn't exhaustion, or heat, or wishful madness. The metal was talking to him, and it knew him. "Say it again," he whispered aloud, eyes darting across the workshop, though he was alone. "Go on then." But the metal didn't repeat itself, just glowed patiently in the forge, innocent as could be. He didn't tell anyone. Not the stable master, not the alewife who sometimes lingered too long near his bench. Who could he tell? "Hello, I'm talking to steel now. It says my name like an old friend." That would go over well. The next day the voice returned, not just saying his name, but finishing his thoughts. Don't forget the third fold. He'd been about to remember that. Hadn't said a word. "Your father used to hum that tune, remember?" And he did. The tune, the memory. Vague, fuzzy, from years ago, a half-mumbled lullaby, sung with iron-flecked breath as his father worked the bellows late into the night. Ferrin hadn't thought of it in over a decade. His father had been dead for nearly as long. He left the forge early that day. Now, in medieval villages, a smith was part artisan, part mystery worker. People both feared and revered them. They turned raw earth into swords and ploughs. Some folks whispered that smiths knew the language of devils, that every strike of the hammer was a bargain. Of course, the church disapproved of that idea. One 13th-century bishop even tried banning blacksmiths from working on Sundays, because the anvil might echo blasphemies. Historians still argue whether that decree was ever enforced. But Ferrin suddenly understood why those fears had started. The metal wasn't just helping, it was inside him now. Not physically, but some part of his thoughts, his memories, his fears. It had access. The next whisper came not in the forge, but in his sleep. All things yearned to return to their origin. He woke up gasping. The words still echoed in his mind. Not frightening, but vast, like a mountain speaking through fog. He rubbed his temples. Maybe this was divine, maybe not, but it was becoming something. The following morning, Ferrin noticed something strange with his tools. His hammer, always slightly off balance from a loose haft, now swung perfectly. The head no longer clanged unpredictably. It sang, every strike, harmonizing with the anvil like it was guided. Even the bellows seemed easier to pump, as if the forge fire welcomed air rather than fought it. He began experimenting. He whispered back, softly, under his breath, as he shaped a blade, "What do you want?" The metal hummed, not a voice this time, but a warm agreement, an affirmation, as if to say, "We are here to make." Now, here's a curious tidbit. In some Norse sagas, blacksmiths weren't merely craftsmen, they were seers. One saga even describes a smith who bent the future into iron, forging events with every blow. Scholars usually dismiss this as metaphor, but Ferrin might have disagreed, because one day, while crafting a simple horseshoe, the voice said, "There is a child in the village with a crooked leg. This will help." He paused. "What do you mean? It's just a shoe." "Bend it one notch wider on the left. Trust us." He did. He delivered it to the stable master, claiming it was extra sturdy. 2 days later, the man's daughter came by to thank him. Her limp was lighter. The horse had walked easier than it ever had. She smiled wide, something rare for her. "Thanks, Smith," she said, cheeks bright. "You're a miracle worker." Ferrin chuckled hollowly. "Wouldn't go that far." But he began keeping notes. In the margins of scrap parchment, on the back of old supply lists. The whispers had rhythm, timing, a strange consistency, like a logic all its own. It wasn't random. The metal spoke when it wanted him to do something with it. One morning, the voice said, "Do not strike today, just listen." And he did. He spent the entire day in silence, staring into the embers, hands still. At first, he thought he'd gone mad, but then he heard something else. The subtle shift of airflow behind the coals, the crackle of impurities burning off. And something deeper, a pattern to the hissing and cooling, like language, like breath. The forge had always been his livelihood. Now it felt like a cathedral. That night, by candlelight, Ferrin stood over the anvil and whispered back, "What are you?" The reply came slower this time, measured. "We are what remains when stars die." He dropped the candle. Now modern science tells us that iron, the kind he worked every day, is forged in the hearts of massive stars. It's true. Supernovae spread it through the galaxy. Every iron atom in your blood was born from stellar collapse. But Ferrin didn't know that. Not really. Still, somehow, the words rang true. The whispers didn't demand worship, didn't issue threats. They simply offered knowing, a gentle push, a path, and Ferrin was walking it, whether he understood it or not. He no longer asked whether it was real. The better question now was how far would it go? Ferrin didn't sleep much that week. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard echoes of the forge, not the hissing and hammering, but the voice that had started weaving itself into his memories. It wasn't just commenting anymore. It was digging. He stood by the hearth one evening, rubbing a thin line of soot between his thumb and forefinger. The day's final embers pulsed red like sleepy eyes, and then the voice returned. "You dropped the nail in the stream when you were 9. Ferrin's breath caught. That memory had been long buried, an ordinary day with his father who was showing him how to temper metal. Ferrin had dropped a tiny crooked nail in the creek behind their home and cried for an hour. His father had scolded him lightly, then patted his head and made another. "How could the metal know that?" he whispered aloud, not expecting an answer. "You were there? We are in the things you forget." That made his skin crawl and somehow calm him at once. Now, just a touch of context for us outsiders. Blacksmiths in medieval times weren't particularly known for introspection. Their world was physical, heated, immediate, but Ferrin was shifting. The forge had become a confessional, the iron a mirror. One morning, as he stoked the fire, the voice offered something new. "Would you like to see your mother again?" Ferrin blinked hard. That was cruel. His mother had died when he was 12. A fever took her in the spring. He remembered her only vaguely, smells more than words. Boiled pears, lanolin, smoke. He didn't answer, just clenched his jaw and struck the anvil once, loud enough to shut out everything else. The voice was quiet after that, as if apologizing. That evening he poured molten metal into a new mold, shaped almost like a pendant. He hadn't planned to. His hands had moved on their own. The metal guided him now like it was sketching with him, dreaming through him. When it cooled, the pendant shimmered strangely in the firelight. Not gold, not silver, but somewhere in between, a color that didn't quite have a name. He touched it, half afraid it might whisper again. Not yet. Now for a strange but true historical wrinkle. Some medieval alchemists believed certain metals held impressions of the soul, as in you could trap part of a person inside a well-forged object. It was dismissed by later scholars, of course, but even now, odd tales survive of rings that hum, blades that weep, and lockets that vibrate in the presence of their owners. Ferrin didn't know any of that, but the pendant made him feel watched. He strung it on a leather cord and wore it under his shirt, unsure why, and every night afterward, his dreams became more vivid, memories that weren't his, or maybe were. He saw stars spinning, oceans boiling, shapes forming in lightless caves. voices speaking in deep choral tones across enormous distances. He'd wake with tears on his face, and no idea why. One morning, he overheard the village boys whispering about him. He talks to himself now, one said. Mumbles at the fire. Another chimed in. My dad says he's hexed. Ferrin didn't confront them. What could he say? Yes, I do whisper to the metal, and sometimes it whispers back. He did begin talking less, laughing less. The pub lost its charm. The idle gossip bored him. The world felt like it was shrinking, while inside the forge, everything was expanding. One night, he lit the fire without needing flint. A single breath across the coals, and the flames leapt up like obedient dogs. He wasn't surprised. The metal began asking questions now. Why did you stop drawing when you were young? Because I was bad at it, Ferrin muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. You weren't. Your uncle said that to hurt you. He stared into the flame. The uncle was long dead. He'd forgotten the insult or thought he had. But the metal hadn't. It remembered everything. One morning, Ferrin noticed a change in his own movements. He was faster, sharper, but also gentler. His hammer struck without wasted force. He could feel when the metal wanted to move and when it resisted, as if they were dancing. And then came the strangest moment of all. The metal laughed. Not loudly, not like a man's laugh, but as he worked a blade one afternoon, he misstepped and spilled water across the anvil. It hissed and sputtered. He swore, and then between the hiss and the pop, there was a warm, lilting sound. Clumsy, it said, amusement sparkling in its tone. He laughed with it, despite himself. Oh, now you have a sense of humor? We always did. You just weren't listening. Historians still argue whether early blacksmiths believed metal had awareness. Some say it was poetic metaphor. Others think they genuinely believed iron and copper could feel, remember, and even speak, if only in a way the soul, not the ears, could hear. Ferrin was beginning to believe the latter, because soon it wasn't just him the metal spoke to. One afternoon a traveller visited the forge, an old woman in a cloak too fine for the roads she claimed to have travelled. She asked for a horseshoe, ordinary request. As Ferrin worked, she watched him too closely. You hear it, don't you? She asked. Just as he quenched the shoe, his hammer stopped mid-swing. Pardon? The metal, she said, almost smiling. It speaks. He didn't answer. But the air shifted. She hears us too, the voice said. Not in his mind, in the room. He looked at the woman. She was smiling now, not kindly. You're not alone, Ferrin, she said. And that's both a blessing and a curse. Ferrin said nothing, at first. He stared at the woman across the forge, at the cloak that shimmered like cooled steel, the thin leather gloves, with symbols burned faintly along the knuckles, and the eyes that didn't quite blink when they should. She watched the coals as if expecting them to reply. He tightened his grip on the tongs. The pendant beneath his tunic grew warm. You've heard it a long time, he said, more statement than question. She inclined her head. Since I was 12, though it doesn't speak to me as kindly as it seems to speak to you. Ferrin gave a cautious frown. It's not kind, just knowing. That's the first test, she murmured, half to herself. You passed. The forge popped loudly. Sparks skittered into the dim air, and for a moment, Ferrin saw something shift in her shadow, something taller than her body should allow. But the light shifted, and the illusion vanished. She stepped closer to the anvil. Do you know what it showed me first? Ferrin shook his head. Venice, she whispered. 1,000 miles away. I'd never left my village, but one day I poured tin into a cast for a goblet, and it spoke. It showed me salt water lapping at stone, gondoliers singing, coins clinking beneath black velvet. She looked at him then, truly looked, and I saw you. Now just a note for the sleepy historians. Venice was in fact a leading hub of metallurgy in the medieval world. Their glassmakers were guarded like state secrets, but there's no record, none, that the forge ever whispered to anyone about a village blacksmith with no schooling and a talent for getting ash in his beard. Ferrin raised an eyebrow. You saw me? In the reflection of the goblet. You were standing right here, wearing that same look like someone slapped you with mystery. He crossed his arms, wary. What do you want? She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Nothing, yet. The pendant under his shirt pulsed again. She has more names than faces, the metal whispered, low and grave. He took a subtle step back. You've built something already, she said, motioning toward the corner of the workshop. The little thing you couldn't explain, like you were guided. The device. Yes. The whisper had nudged him toward it days ago. A tangle of copper wires, a disc of bronze, etched with spirals, tiny gears interlocking in ways he hadn't been trained to make. It looked like a compass if a compass were designed by someone who had never seen Earth. It doesn't do anything, Farron said. You're wrong, she replied. It listens. He hesitated, then lied. I threw it out. You didn't, she said calmly. It called to me from the road. The forge snapped again, a loud metallic crack, like a lid sealing shut. She reached into her cloak and withdrew something small, a coin, tarnished and old. She flipped it toward him, and it spun in the air before landing flat on the anvil, a Roman denarius. Farron blinked. Where did you get that? From another one who heard, before he vanished. Her tone turned grim. Most of us do, eventually. He picked up the coin. It was cool, but as he held it, he heard it, faint, like a murmur from another room. It was humming. He tried to melt us, the voice said, softer than usual. He wanted silence. Farron set it down quickly. The woman watched him closely. Do you understand yet? You're not chosen. You're tuned, like a wire that just happens to vibrate at the right frequency. He looked down at his hands, collused, stained, trembling slightly now. I didn't ask for this, he muttered. No one ever does. She turned to go, but it doesn't stop it from wanting more. Before she left, she added, You'll build something else soon, something bigger. The whispers will get louder. She paused at the door. And when they do, be careful what you let them tell you. And then she was gone, leaving only the echo of footsteps and a sharp chill in the space she'd just occupied. Now, if you're curious, there's a fringe belief in certain historical circles that objects can act as resonant witnesses, tools or trinkets that pick up trace information from their environments. Theories so flimsy they barely hold water, but somehow, in Farron's world, they held molten metal. The next day, Farron couldn't concentrate. The pendant hummed. The Roman coin buzzed faintly in the drawer. The unfinished device on his bench pulsed like it wanted to breathe. And then the voices returned in chorus. Not just one now. Many. Whispers layered on top of each other. Languages he didn't understand. Sounds that weren't quite syllables. Harmonies both soothing and maddening. He covered his ears. Stop, he hissed aloud. One at a time. Everything fell silent. Blessedly. Then softly, one voice. His voice, from when he was a boy. Will I ever be good enough? Farron staggered back like he'd been punched. That was from a day he'd cried over bent tongs. After his father barked at him for ruining a blade, he remembered the shame, the dirt beneath his nails, the sting behind his eyes. You were, the whisper answered. Even then. He sank to the floor, breath shaky. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. He'd built a device he didn't understand, had met a stranger who saw his face in metal before ever meeting him. Now he was hearing his own forgotten questions, echoed back from steel. He stood slowly, glanced at the Roman coin and whispered, What happens if I listen too long? The response came after a pause. You change. Farron didn't light the forge the next morning. He simply sat in the workshop, staring at the shapes his tools made when left scattered across the bench, curved tongs forming a broken crescent, the hammer leaning just so against a half-rolled scroll of brass wire. His fingers twitched with the urge to rearrange everything, but he resisted. He didn't want the metal to talk today. But it didn't need his permission. We see you still, it whispered, not from a single object, but from the room itself. The anvil, the coal bin, the rivets on the door, like the forge had inhaled the voice, and was now exhaling it, breath by breath. Farron stood and paced. I need quiet, he muttered, just for a day. One day. Silence followed, but not the comforting kind. This was watching silence. The kind you feel down your spine as if someone or something is waiting for you to speak first. He pushed open the forge door and stepped outside. It was market day in the village, and life carried on obliviously. Children ran barefoot through puddles, dogs barked at goats, and vendors shouted their prices over one another like roosters trying to outcrow. The butcher's son waved at him. Ferin managed a nod. He walked with no destination, letting the clatter of carts and chatter of townsfolk drown out the whispers. But every bit of iron he passed, a hinge, a horseshoe, a knife on a vendor's belt, felt like it knew him. He turned sharply down a side path and found himself by the stream where he'd dropped that nail as a boy. The water gurgled gently over smooth stones. Here, at least, the world didn't feel alive with voices. He crouched, scooped up a handful of water, and splashed his face. A rusted nail poked out from between two rocks. He froze. It couldn't be the same one, could it? He reached down and picked it up. Pitted, bent, unremarkable. But the moment it touched his skin, you cried for hours. He never saw. He dropped it like it was red hot. Now, here's something strange from the dusty corners of history. Some early metallurgists believed that objects could retain emotional charge, imprints of moments. That metal didn't just reflect a maker's will but recorded it like grooves in a wax tablet. Ferin didn't know that theory, but he was living it. Back at the forge he tried to busy himself, polished some hinges, oiled the bellows, but the metal was waiting. You cannot unhear what has been heard. Maybe I don't want to hear it anymore, he snapped. Maybe I just want to make shoes and tools like before. The pendant around his neck pulsed once, then stop asking questions. He flinched. It was right. He was asking. Every silence, every hesitation was an invitation. Later that afternoon, while shaping a plowshare, Ferin caught himself whispering back again. What do you mean, change? The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, the metal softened faster than it should have, responding like it wanted to be molded. The more you listen, the more you become us. Become, knowing, a vessel, a bridge. That evening, Ferin locked the forge door for the first time in years. He paced the workshop, eyes flicking toward the unfinished device in the corner. He couldn't remember half the steps he'd used to build it. It had simply formed, day by day, whisper by whisper. He pulled it from the shelf. It was roughly the size of a bread loaf, with overlapping discs that turned at the slightest touch. Symbols etched into the surface had begun glowing faintly when he held it. Once, when a dog barked outside, one of the discs spun twice on its own. He sat and watched it, half daring it to move again. It didn't. Not until he whispered, "What am I building?" The topmost disc shifted slowly, then again, then stopped. A moment later, a soft pulse of light rippled across the device, not like firelight, like moonlight, reflected in a still pond. A translator, the voice said, from inside the thing. A translator for what? Ferin asked. The old language, the one before yours. He exhaled slowly. Who spoke it? Stone, fire, time. He rubbed his temples. That sip's not a language. You are learning it now. And here's your historical twist for the night. Some ancient cultures, Babylonian, Egyptian, even Etruscan, believed in tongues, primal languages, lost to humanity, spoken by the earth itself. The idea was fringe even back then. But Ferin, he was getting grammar lessons in his sleep. He returned the device to the shelf and sat on the floor, back against the forge wall. I just wanted to be a blacksmith, he whispered. The fire crackled softly. You still are, it said. You just forge more than metal now. The pendant throbbed again, stronger this time. It wasn't just warmth. It hurt. Ferin yanked it off and dropped it to the floor. It bounced once, then spun on its edge like a coin, spinning longer than anything should have. 3 seconds. 5. 9. Then it stopped. Silence. And then from the pendant itself came a sound he hadn't heard since boyhood. His mother's laugh. Not a whisper. Not a memory. Her actual laugh. He stared at the pendant, heart thudding. What are you? He asked the air. The answer came not in words but in feeling, like molten silver flowing through his thoughts. And for the first time he understood something deeper than language. The metal wasn't just talking. It was remembering. Ferin didn't sleep that night. He lay on the floor of the workshop with his coat as a pillow, eyes fixed on the pendant, resting motionless a few feet away. It no longer glowed. No more warmth. No whispers, but the air felt thick with its memory. like the moment just after thunder. When morning came, he still hadn't moved. His back ached, and the stone floor had left cold patches across his shoulder blades. But he felt clearer, sharpened, tired in a way that didn't feel fixable by rest. The forge hissed softly as he lit it, the fire leaping up as though it had been waiting. He didn't speak, he barely breathed. Instead, he reached for a new bar of bronze, heated it slowly, and let the metal guide him. The whispers didn't speak aloud today, but they didn't need to. They'd already taught him the rhythm. Melt, fold, shape. Something was being built. The device he'd left on the shelf, its disc still and dark the night before, glimmered faintly as he worked. No movement, just awareness. Then the voice returned, low and intimate. "It's time. For what?" Farron murmured. "For the letter." He froze mid-swing. "What letter?" "The one you haven't written yet. The one we remember." He stepped back from the forge, heart racing. "I don't write. I don't even have paper. We'll show you how. Use bronze." So that's what he did. He melted down a few leftover trimmings, poured them into a small mold, flat and wide like a breadboard, and waited as the metal cooled. Then, guided by impulse more than understanding, he took a chisel and began carving. Not words, symbols. They flowed through him like a song he'd forgotten the lyrics to, but not the melody. Lines and curves, repeating spirals, geometric intersections. Nothing human in it, yet utterly familiar. By dusk, the bronze plate was covered. He sat back and looked at it, this strange, impossible letter, and then he heard it, not in his mind, but from the device. A soft click. One disc rotated. Another followed. It was reading the letter. Now here's a historical gem. The oldest known written language, Sumerian cuneiform, was etched into clay using reeds. Some scholars argue the stylus wasn't just practical. It mirrored the sharp sounds of speech itself. But imagine if someone had etched letters not of language, but for metal to read. That's what Farron had done. He didn't understand a word of what he'd carved, but the device did. Its center glowed pale blue, then green. Then something strange happened. It spoke, not in the whispering voice that had haunted his forge for weeks, but aloud, in a clear tone that came from everywhere at once. Message received. Farron stumbled backward.
"What message?"
he asked aloud. "We sent it before you were born. You've returned it." He stared at the device like it might sprout legs and walk away. "You used me to build a message you wrote." "We don't write. You wrote it with what you are." The pendant pulsed again, faintly as if nodding. Farron shook his head. "I don't know what that means." The fire dimmed without touch. "You will." He sat there for a long while. Eventually he rose and walked to the river with the bronze plate. He stared at the water, wondering if he should throw it in, let it vanish like that childhood nail. But his hands wouldn't let go. Instead he wrapped the plate in linen and placed it inside a small oak chest he hadn't used in years, the one his father had made to store rare metals. He buried it beneath a pile of scrap, behind the forge. He couldn't destroy it. Not yet. That evening the wind shifted. It carried with it a new scent. Leather, ink, something musky like aged wine. Farron turned to find a rider approaching his workshop. She dismounted with ease, her cloak embroidered in bronze thread, catching the light like flame. She held no weapon, but her belt bore tools he didn't recognize, like measuring devices, tiny compasses, and glass tubes filled with shimmering fluid. "I'm told you've made a letter," she said simply. Farron stiffened. "Who told you that?" She gave him a small smile. "The wind." He didn't smile back. "You're not the woman from before," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm what follows her." Her boots made no sound on the stone. She stepped into the forge as though she'd lived there her whole life. Her eyes scanned the shelves, the hanging tongs, the still glowing coals. She touched none of it. Finally she looked at the device on the shelf. "You built that." "I did," Farron said, "though I don't know how." "That's how it starts," she murmured. "Every time." She pulled something from her satchel, another letter, not etched in bronze, but embossed onto leather with ink, so dark it seemed to drink the firelight. She held it out to him. "For you." He took it, hesitantly. It was warm. He opened it. Inside were the same symbols he'd carved, but written differently, tighter, more compact, like his letter translated into a more advanced dialect, a language evolving. "Who are you?" he asked. She turned to leave, already mounting her horse. "Just a courier." "From where?" She smiled. "From before," and then she was gone, hoofbeats fading into the night. Ferrin stood in the doorway staring after her. The wind tugged at his tunic. The pendant lay still against his chest, and the voice whispered once more, "You are now part of the chain." That night, Ferrin didn't dream of fire or metal or even voices. He dreamed of circles, endless, luminous circles, each nested within the next, rotating not in the way wheels turn, but like thoughts shifting just beyond comprehension. The stars moved through them, not above or below, but inside, caught in the geometry, as if every light in the night sky was just part of some divine clock. When he awoke, the pattern remained behind his eyelids. He sat up slowly, breath shallow, as if a secret had been whispered in his sleep that he wasn't quite allowed to remember yet. The forge was still cold. He hadn't lit it, but on the shelf the device spun gently. Unprovoked, it stopped as soon as he looked at it. He rose and went to the workbench, feeling suddenly like a child about to be tested. The leather letter sat beside the device, unmoved. He rolled it open again, stared at the shapes. They weren't just symbols now. His eyes began to feel the meaning, not understand, not translate, but feel like pressing your palm to a warm stone and knowing it sat in sunlight before you touched it. He pulled a blank sheet of vellum from the drawer and dipped a stylus into his ink and began to draw. No one had taught him how to make star charts. Certainly no one in the village could read the sky beyond storms coming or good for harvest. But Ferrin's hand moved with eerie certainty, circles within circles, intersecting lines. He placed dots and arcs like a mapmaker, etching rivers into unknown lands. He didn't know what he was drawing until it was done. He stepped back and stared. The device on the shelf vibrated once, softly, like it was pleased. He had drawn an alignment. 6 celestial bodies, planets, perhaps, or stars, arranged in a configuration he'd never seen. One of the outer orbs was shaded, as if hidden. The entire image glowed faintly under firelight, and as he stared, a single word bloomed in his mind. Tomorrow. He didn't ask how he knew, he just knew. The sky would match this diagram tomorrow. Historians still argue whether early European smiths ever dabbled in astronomy. Some point to inscriptions on church bells showing lunar phases, or iron instruments found buried near megalithic sites. But it's fringe talk, nothing definitive. And yet here stood Ferrin, a man who had never read a scroll of Latin, charting the cosmos on sheepskin like it was second nature. He took the chart outside, holding it under the open sky. The moon hung high and pale, quiet, distant, but somehow watching. The metal hummed beneath his feet. He whispered, "What happens tomorrow?" No answer, but the forge door creaked open behind him on its own. Inside, the fire had relit itself. Unprompted, he turned back slowly, heart pounding. The fire was calm, blue at the base, controlled, like it was waiting. Something was coming. The next morning, the village was restless. Storms had been forecast by the older farmers. Skies too still, they said. The animals were skittish. A goat had broken loose near the bakery. Children stayed close to home, and mothers whispered with drawn faces near their doorways. Ferrin worked without speaking. He forged nothing. Instead, he rearranged the tools on his bench into concentric circles, tongs, files, punches, then added pieces of chalk and scrap iron between them, matching the pattern from the chart. It wasn't ritual. It wasn't spell work. It was calibration. As the sun began to lower, he placed the device at the center of it all. Then he waited, and the sky dimmed strangely, not with dusk, but like a veil being pulled across a flame. A pale ring formed around the sun. Not full darkness, but not full light. An eclipse. Ferrin gasped. He hadn't known that word. Not consciously, but he'd drawn it, right down to the shadowed orb. The device began to hum, a low, melodic vibration like glass resonating in a cathedral. Then, one by one, the discs rotated into alignment. Click! Click, click, light poured from the grooves in the bronze. The forger's flame bent inward, not outward, as if pulled towards something unseen, and the voice returned, not as a whisper but a presence, bigger than the forge, bigger than him. You have aligned the gates. What gates? He asked, barely able to hear his own voice. The ones between what was and what might be. The air inside the workshop thickened. Time didn't feel right anymore. A drop of sweat froze mid-fall, suspended like a pearl. Then the device pulsed once, violently. Ferrin fell back and saw, not with eyes, with mind. Galaxies spiraled in burning silence. Suns erupted, moons cracked, time unspooled like molten copper. He saw himself hammering, aging, dissolving, and others, blacksmiths in different eras, different lands. Some hammering, some hiding, some screaming, all touched, connected. Somewhere in this cascade, Ferrin saw a forge on a mountain top, its fire blue as glacier light, a woman with skin like hammered gold, a blade made not of metal but memory. Then it all snapped back. He was on the floor of his workshop, the device dark and still. He gasped, lungs starved for air. The pendant was warm again, his hands were shaking, his hair damp with sweat, but he wasn't afraid. He was awake, and the stars had spoken. The stars didn't speak again the next day, not aloud, anyway, but Ferrin could still feel them. Their echo lingered behind his ribs like the aftertaste of something rich and ancient, something he'd never eaten but somehow missed. He kept the forge cool that morning, let the fire rest. The device sat quietly on the bench, as inert as a lump of coal, as though it too needed time to recover. Ferrin's tools lay undisturbed in the spiral pattern he'd made the day before, though now they felt less like a calibration and more like a question someone else had answered. He stared at them, as if looking hard enough might unlock some new truth, and that's when the merchant arrived. He came on foot, which was odd for someone with that finer coat, dark green wool, brass buttons, boots that didn't belong to muddy roads. A leather case slung across his back. No cart, no guards, just one man, alone, walking straight toward Ferrin's forge, like it was the only place in the world worth visiting. "Morning," the stranger called. Ferrin didn't answer. He wiped his hands on a cloth, watching as the man stepped through the doorframe without invitation. His eyes scanned the workshop quickly, too quickly, as if ticking things off a list. "I heard there's a smith here who's been doing unusual work." Ferrin said nothing. The man smiled easily. "You've made something that spins without touch, something that lights up in the absence of flame." He turned to face Ferrin directly. "I'd like to see it." "No," Ferrin replied simply. The stranger arched a brow. "I'm offering payment. Gold, if that matters." "It doesn't." "Then knowledge." "Answers." "I know what that thing is." That got Ferrin's attention. But he didn't show it. He folded his arms instead. "You're a little far from a university," he said. "If you're a scholar, I'm more itinerant," the man replied, with a shrug. "Scholar by trade, seeker by compulsion." He walked over to the device on the bench, stopping just short of touching it. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Voice low now. "I know what it told me," Ferrin said. The man chuckled. "So it speaks to you." Ferrin's mouth tightened, not in words always. Now for a little historical flavor. Merchant philosophers weren't unheard of in the Middle Ages, especially during the later periods when trade routes brought more than spices and silk. They brought books, heretical ideas, and strange instruments. One such traveller is rumoured to have offered a monastery, a clock that needed no winding, though it vanished shortly after he did. Ferrin didn't know that story, but he was beginning to suspect this man had read it. "You're not the first," the stranger said. "There have been others, though few build devices like this. Most are too scared to get past the dreaming." Ferrin frowned. "Dreaming?" The visions, the man clarified, circling the workbench, the alignment, the voice, the stars. "You think you're alone until you realize you're part of a, let's say, experiment. A long one." He turned to Ferrin, eyes gleaming. "Did it show you the spiral?" Ferrin hesitated. "You've seen it too." "I've seen drawings of it," the man admitted. "Etched into obsidian, painted in ochre on cliff walls in the north, inscribed in teeth." He paused. but never firsthand. You want to use the device, Ferrin said flatly. I want to understand it, the stranger corrected. Which might require using it, yes. I don't trust you. I wouldn't either, the man said to his credit. They stood there a moment, the silence filling with the soft hiss of the forge coals cooling. Then the man reached into his coat and pulled out a roll of parchment, worn at the edges. I didn't come empty-handed. He unrolled it carefully on the workbench. It was another chart, like Ferrin's star map, but older, faded. The lines were cruder, as though scratched by someone unfamiliar with circles. Still, Ferrin recognized the shape. The same alignment, the same hidden orb. But this one had something his chart did not. A name etched beneath the largest circle in neat, steady Latin script. Vosain Furim, the iron voice. Furian looked up slowly. The merchant's face was grim now. No smile, no salesmanship, just shared awe. They called it that centuries ago, he said. The first whisperers. Who were they? A few monks, a desert hermit, a sick child who drew impossible maps before vanishing into the hills. Where did it come from? The merchant sighed. That, my friend, is the question. Ferrin felt something shift behind his ribs. Not fear exactly, but proximity, as if he'd stepped into a room where someone had been speaking his name before he arrived. He rolled up the parchment and handed it back. You've seen enough. The merchant didn't argue. He packed the scroll carefully, gave a small bowl, and turned to leave. But just before he stepped out the door, he paused. They always go silent, you know. What? The voices, after the alignment. For a time at least, it's to rest perhaps, or calibration. He looked back at Ferrin. You're lucky, it's not done with you yet. Then he was gone, walking back into the muddy lanes of the village like any other passing merchant. But Ferrin knew better. He went back inside, stared at the device and whispered, Are you still there? No answer, not even a flicker. But as he reached out to cover it with cloth, he noticed the edge of the disc was warm, not like heat, like breath. The next few days passed quietly. The forge returned to its routine hum, the kind Ferrin used to find comforting before the voices began. He shod horses, repaired a snapped ploughshare, even made a set of simple hinges for the tavern door. The townsfolk returned, one by one, as if nothing had happened, as if the stars hadn't bent, as if the fire hadn't spoken. But Ferrin felt it, beneath the calm, the way a man feels the sea swell just before a wave breaks. The voices had gone quiet, just as the merchant philosopher said they would. Not gone, just silent. Still he waited for the murmurs, watched the corners of the forge like a cat waiting for a mouse. He placed the device gently in a wooden box, wrapped in cloth, and locked it away. But the box throbbed faintly at night. Not heat, not sound, just awareness. Until one morning the silence itself broke. Not from the forge, from a boy. It was Tomek, the butcher's son, 10 years old, scrawny, usually covered in dust and mischief. He stumbled into the forge just after sunrise, panting like he'd run the entire way. His eyes were wide, panicked. Smith Ferrin, he gasped. They're looking for you. Ferrin set down his hammer. Who is? The boy hesitated, then whispered. Others. Travellers, like that merchant, but not like him. Ferrin wiped his hands. Where did you see them? Outside town. 3 of them. One carries a black rod, and one wears a mask. A metal one. Ferrin's blood chilled. Metal masks were rare in their corner of the world. Plague doctors sometimes wore them in the cities. Yes, but this didn't feel like a visit from healers. This felt like something else. He thanked Tomek and sent him home with a scrap of bread and a stern warning to say nothing. Then he opened the wooden box. The device was awake. Every disc spun at once. Not fast, not noisy, but precisely, like it had been expecting this moment. Ferrin touched it gently. They are not new, came the voice, quiet now, like a whisper between walls. They have listened longer than you have breathed. Are they dangerous? Yes. Do they speak to metal too? No. Then how? They take what speaks. Ferrin's fingers clenched around the edge of the bench. Why? Because they fear what it might become. And here's a strange historical tangent for your sleepy mind. In some Byzantine records, there are vague accounts of metallic men who appeared in villages after celestial events. Always silent, always collecting certain tools or relics. Most scholars chalk these stories up to metaphor, panic-induced superstition. But Ferrin didn't have the luxury of metaphor. He had the reality. He wrapped the device again, tighter this time, and packed it into a hidden compartment beneath the anvil, one his father had built during a war, when swords needed to be hidden from tacksmen. Funny how old fears become new again. Then he waited. The strangers arrived by midday. 3 of them, just as Tomic said. The first was cloaked in dull grey wool, walking stiffly, almost like he hadn't used his legs in weeks. His face was obscured by a hood, but his hands, gloved, moved with sharp, almost mechanical precision. The second was shorter, broader, dressed in a heavy coat, lined with metal discs that clinked faintly when he moved. He carried a rod of black iron, polished like obsidian. No insignia, no crest, just presence. The third wore the mask. It covered their entire face, silver and smooth, with no eye holes, no mouth slit, nothing, just a blank reflective surface. Their breath rasped faintly, not loud, but unnerving, not natural. Ferrin the smith, the rod-bearer said. His voice was low, rehearsed. Ferrin stepped out of the forge. That's me. The masked one tilted its head slightly. The motion was wrong, too fluid, too slow, like someone mimicking curiosity without understanding it. We're told you forged an object of interest, the rod-bearer said. I forge lots of things. This one sings. Ferrin didn't answer. We don't come to take, the hooded one added, finally speaking. His voice was papery, like old parchment crackling. We come to guard, to protect others from what they cannot wield. Ferrin gave a humorless chuckle. That's comforting. From men dressed like executioners, the masked figure stepped forward, reached out a hand, gloved in steel-threaded leather, and touched the frame of the forge. A faint tremor shook the bricks. Ferrin said nothing, but inside the anvil, the device pulsed once, hot enough to warm the floor beneath his boots. They hear nothing, the voice whispered, but they sense, like moths to warmth. I don't have what you're looking for, Ferrin said aloud. We know, said the rod-bearer. Yet, he placed a small disc on Ferrin's workbench, flat, black, and etched with a single spiral. Signal us if it speaks again, and if I don't. The rod-bearer didn't answer. The 3 left silently, leaving footprints of soot and gravel behind. As soon as they were out of sight, Ferrin picked up the spiral disc. It was heavier than it looked, and warm. He dropped it into the forge. The fire sputtered for a moment. Then the disc screamed, just once, a high-pitched shriek, like nails against glass. And then it melted into slag, the scream cutting off like a snuffed candle. Ferrin stared into the coals, then turned to the device beneath the anvil, and whispered, We're not alone, are we? No. He sat down slowly, exhaling through clenched teeth. But you already knew that. We knew you would learn. The stars returned that night. Not in the sky. They had never really left, but in Ferrin's mind. They threaded through his thoughts as he slept, painting constellations behind his eyelids like chalk on slate. But this time, the stars were moving, shifting, changing. He awoke with a name on his tongue, though he didn't know its meaning. Irion. It sat in his mouth like an ember, smouldering. A name not of a person, but a place. Or maybe both. A forge, perhaps. Or a star. The device beneath the anvil hummed again, as if responding to the word. Ferrin retrieved it carefully. Every disc spun the moment he touched it, aligning into a new configuration he'd never seen. And then the whispers returned, this time sharper, focused. You are ready for the sword. Ferrin blinked. I'm not a swordsmith. You are now. He hesitated. Then slowly, as though pulled by some forgotten instinct, he moved to the back of the forge and uncovered a bundle of raw iron he'd buried months ago, scrap too impure to use at the time. But now, under his fingers, it felt alive. He lit the forge, not with flint. He breathed across the coals and they ignited. That had only happened once before, on the day of the eclipse. The whispers guided him, not in full sentences this time, but through emotion, image, sensation. Fold the iron, Shape it like memory. Don't quench it. Let it cool in smoke. Carve its name before you finish. He moved as if possessed. Hammer rose, hammer fell, steel rang out, and all the while the voice murmured, about stardust, about ancient violence, about time folding in on itself like red-hot ore. You are not forging a weapon, you are remembering it. Now just to ground this in a historical sliver, iron swords in medieval Europe were typically functional, plain and born of necessity, not mysticism. But in Japanese sword-making, the tamahagani process revered the spirit within the metal. Some blades even bore names, believed to house a soul. Ferrin didn't know those traditions, but he was living something eerily similar. He worked through the night, pouring his strength into every fold. The sword didn't want to be fancy, it wanted to be known. The blade emerged slowly, slim, dark, slightly curved, with veins like silver threads running beneath its surface. No gemstones, no etchings, just balance. It felt like it had always existed. He held it in his hands and whispered, "What now?" And the voice answered with something new. "Ask it." He hesitated. Then, gently, as if addressing a living thing, "Who are you?" The blade vibrated once. A slow pulse ran down its length, and Ferrin saw. He saw a star exploding, a forge deep in a mountain lit by blue fire, a battle on a shore where no waves broke, a woman wielding the blade with tears in her eyes, and finally himself, holding it, in this forge. In this moment, he dropped the sword onto the anvil. It didn't clatter, it rang, like a bell, a low resonant note that lingered far longer than it should have. The device on the shelf glowed again. "You have remembered it," the whisper said. "Now it remembers you." Ferrin leaned against the wall, stunned. The blade no longer felt like something he had made. It felt like something he had released. He wrapped it in cloth and tucked it beneath the bench. Then, for reasons he didn't fully understand, he walked to the edge of the village. The stars above were shifting again, subtly. Ferrin could almost read them now, the way one reads an old friend's face. A figure waited near the woods. Not the masked ones, not the merchant. This man was older, wrapped in furs, with one arm ending in a brass gauntlet where flesh should have been. His beard was grey, his eyes sharp. "You forged it," the man said, without turning around. Ferrin stiffened. "How do you know?" "I heard the blade's name. In my sleep." He turned. "It woke us. All of us." Ferrin narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The man bowed slightly. "One who used to hear. Before I gave it up." Ferrin's jaw tightened. Why would anyone give it up? The man raised the brass hand. "When it started speaking in my voice." They stood in silence. Then Ferrin asked, "Why are you here?" "To warn you." "Of what?" The man exhaled slowly. "Of the ones who listen but do not hear." Ferrin blinked. "The masked ones." "No." "Worse?" He stepped closer. "There are others like you, Ferrin, others like me, all across the land. We forge what we sip told. Tools, bells, swords, devices. Some listen gently. Others," he trailed off, "others twist the voice into something else." The wind shifted. "You'll hear from them soon," the man said. "They'll come not to ask what you've heard, but what you're willing to say aloud." Then he turned to go. But just before fading into the trees, he paused. "Be careful who you share the sword with. It cuts more than flesh." And then he vanished. Ferrin returned to the forge, silent. He didn't light the fire. He simply unwrapped the sword again, laid it across his lap and whispered, "What are you meant for?" The blade didn't speak. But it pulsed again, and in the hum of the metal, Ferrin heard the echo of stars being born. The sword stayed quiet, but Ferrin couldn't stop hearing it. Not with his ears, not even with his mind exactly, but with the same strange place inside him where the whispers had first taken root. Like the memory of a voice you never quite heard, but always knew. It didn't cry out for blood. It didn't hum with rage. It simply waited, a presence heavier than its weight, sharper than its edge. And yet, for all its quiet, Ferrin knew he couldn't keep it to himself, because the whispers had changed. Not in tone, but in accent. They came now not just from the forge, or the blade, or the device, but from every bit of metal in the village, a nail on the mill's wheelbarrow, the bell at the church tower, a rusted key buried behind the tavern. Everything had started to listen, and Ferrin wasn't the only one noticing. It started with small things. A farmer's scythe began to hum when he passed the blacksmith's door. A child dropped a spoon and swore it sang before hitting the ground. The tavern's tin mugs clinked together without being touched, and then came the letters, 3 in total, left on his workbench overnight, unsigned, each written in the same unnerving handwriting, spidery, deliberate, with symbols etched into the margins. The first read, "You are not the first smith, but you might be the last." The second, "The voice does not speak, it remembers. Do you know what it remembers about you?" The third came with something else, a coin, not a denarius this time, but newer, shiny, and impossibly light. When Ferrin touched it, the coin didn't hum, it wept. Tiny droplets of silver ran down its sides, like dew on morning grass, but the tears moved upward, defying gravity before vanishing into the air with a soft chime. The forge fire flared suddenly, as if responding, and the whisper returned. "The guild has heard your blade." Ferrin froze. The guild? The ones who build but do not forge, who remember but do not feel. You mean the ones like the merchant, the masked ones? They are echoes of the guild, probes, reminders. He stared down at the weeping coin. And what am I? Unbidden. It was the first time the voice had sounded almost amused. Now, if you're a fan of obscure medieval secrets, and who isn't at this hour, there are legends of underground groups called silent forges. These secretive collectives supposedly guarded knowledge too dangerous for kings or clergy. Most were dismissed as alchemical fiction, tales told by drunk masons and paranoid monks. But Ferrin wasn't laughing, because the next night he received an invitation. It came in the same spidery hand, a scrap of metal engraved so finely it looked printed, not carved. When held up to the firelight, words shimmered across its surface. "Forge complete. You are summoned. Midnight, Northfield. Bring nothing but what you've made. No name, no seal, just the unmistakable pull of inevitability." Ferrin considered ignoring it. He really did. But the sword had already begun to hum again, low and constant, like the bass note in a church organ. It wanted to be seen. So at midnight, beneath a sliver-moon sky, Ferrin left the forge. He carried the sword wrapped in cloth, not hidden, contained. It had become a lantern in the dark, drawing eyes even when veiled. The Northfield was empty at first. Cold, quiet, dew-soaked. Then the mist thickened, and figures began to emerge. 12 of them, not robed, not armored, just still, ordinary clothes in extraordinary silence. They stood in a perfect circle, spaced evenly around a strange emblem scorched into the grass. One Ferrin recognized from his star chart, the alignment, the spiral. He stopped at the edge. A woman stepped forward, hair braided in coils like wire, arms marked with soot and fine scars. No metal mask, no theatrics, just presence. "Ferrin," she said. He nodded, saying nothing. "You have forged the memory blade, so that's what it was called. We felt it, across miles, through time." Ferrin eyed the others. "Who are you?" She didn't smile. "The Guild of the Unspoken Alloy." So the voice hadn't been speaking metaphorically. She stepped closer. "You've done what few could, unassisted, untrained, with no ancient library, no maps, just instinct." He glanced down at the sword. "I had help. The forge," she said, almost reverently. "Is that what it is?" "More than that," she whispered. "It is what remains of something older than tools, older than fire, older than language. It doesn't speak to everyone, only those who are still soft enough to be reshaped." He swallowed. "And now what?" "Now," she said, "you must decide what to do with it." She motioned to the circle. One by one, the others stepped forward and laid items at Ferrin's feet. A spoon, twisted into the shape of a feather, a nail that rang when dropped, endlessly, a key with no teeth, but which turned on thought alone. All of them glowed faintly with the same knowing warmth. Artifacts, whispers, forged. "We have each built," she said, and lost. Some of us went mad, some were taken, but you brought back the blade. You remembered it. Ferrin didn't speak. The wind rustled the grass. The sword holds more than you know, she said. It remembers wounds, the kind you never speak of, and the ones not yet dealt. She placed her hand gently on the cloth. Be cautious, Ferrin. Blades that remember also choose what to forget. And then, as suddenly as they had come, the guild began to fade into the mist. No farewell, no final glance, just absence. By dawn, Ferrin stood alone in the field, sword in hand, and the grass beneath him whispered his name. The sword never left Ferrin's side after that night. It rested against the forge wall by day, and slept beside him by night, wrapped carefully in the same soot-stained cloth, as though it too needed warmth. And though it never again pulsed with the intensity of that first alignment, Ferrin felt its weight in the room, even when his back was turned. But it was not the only thing that had changed. A week passed, and with it came signs. Small at first, a copper ladle that trembled when the moon rose, a pewter cup that hummed softly when brought near the sword, a single rivet in a barrel hoop that shattered spontaneously, splitting clean down the centre, as if protesting its own purpose. And then came the coin, not the Roman denarius, not the weeping silver disc. This one Ferrin made, without meaning to. It started with a whisper. One of those strange, dreamlike voices, distant but firm, shape what cannot hold. So he did. He took a scrap of leftover bronze from the floor, heated it until it shimmered like melted honey, and poured it into a simple mould, nothing fancy. Just a coin. But as he lifted it from the cooling dish, he saw something impossible. The face of a woman, not etched, formed. Her eyes closed, her expression serene, and when he turned the coin over, a symbol waited there, a spiral. The same one burned into the grass at the guild's meeting. Ferrin held it to the firelight, and it blinked, just once. Now, quick interlude, because you deserve a strange bedtime historical nibble. The ancient Celts had a tradition of druid coins that were never used for trade. They bore no denomination, no kingdom crest, just images, often of animals or faces mid-speech. Some said they were used in rituals, others claimed they carried the voices of the dead, but none of them ever blinked. The next morning, Ferrin tested it. He placed the coin beside the memory blade, and for the first time, the sword reacted. It shivered, not visibly, but in resonance, a soft harmonic thrumming, like the blade was singing back to the coin. The forge warmed of its own accord. Sparks flared without striking, and then, without touch, the coin rolled. Perfectly. Across the bench, it stopped at the edge, balanced impossibly on its rim, and spun in place, hovering, humming. Ferrin leaned closer. He heard a voice he hadn't heard in months. His father's. The metal doesn't lie. It remembers who you are even when you forget. He dropped the coin. It clattered to the floor, spinning once more before going still. That was the moment he knew. The blade was only the beginning. Something larger had awakened. The whispers told him what to do next. Forge the vessel. He didn't understand at first. Vessel for what? Memory. He thought it meant a cup, a bowl, a container. But what he forged was neither. Over the course of 5 days and nights, Ferrin built something unlike anything he, or perhaps anyone, had ever made. A lattice of copper and iron, curved into the shape of a human heart, hollow but warm to the touch. Inside it, he placed the blinking coin. Around it, he wound silver wire in fractal spirals. No blueprints, just instinct, just trust. He called it the Heart Forge. The moment it was complete, every metal object in the workshop stilled. The tools, the blade, the device, even the anvil stopped ringing. Silence. Then the Heart Forge pulsed. Once, a heartbeat, and the voices returned, not as guidance this time, but as presence. Dozens, hundreds, overlapping, layered, like metal from every forge that had ever whispered was now gathered here, inside this one impossible object. This is the container, they said. The Echo Vault. The keeper of the deep forge. Ferrin staggered back. Why me? Why here? The voices answered not with words but memory. Visions poured into him. A smith in Carthage, hammering in rhythm with the tides. A girl in ancient Anatolia, shaping tin into spirals that glowed. A prisoner in a stone cell, carving a symbol into her shackles until the metal itself melted. All of them, all remembered, all here, and in the center of it all, the same spiral, the same breath of stars. Ferrin fell to his knees. The heart forge glowed steadily now, warm but not dangerous. A beacon, perhaps, a journal, or something much older. He touched it. "You've become the keeper," said the voice. "You must now choose who may listen next." He reeled at that. Choose? Yes. The voice is not a gift. It is a burden, shared only when earned. The realization hit like a hammer. That was the guild's purpose. Not to collect the knowledge, to filter it, to protect the forge-born truth from falling into the wrong hands, like the masked ones, the rod carriers, the men who sensed the metal's warmth but couldn't hear its voice. He whispered, "And if I choose wrong?" The heart forge beat again, then memory becomes weapon. The implications settled heavy on his shoulders, and yet there was no turning back. That evening, Ferrin rewrapped the memory blade, polished the device, placed the heart forge in a case lined with velvet and rivets etched in that same old language. He cleaned the workshop, wrote a single note, "Gone to listen," and then he stepped out into the night, because the whispers had said one more thing before falling silent again. There are others who still wait to remember. The bell arrived 3 days after Ferrin left the forge. It wasn't sent, delivered, or forged. It simply appeared, hanging from the rafters of the old watchtower at the edge of the village. No one saw who installed it, no one claimed ownership. And yet there it was, suspended by iron chain, smooth and gleaming, though no smith in the region claimed to have cast it. The villagers noticed it at once. You would too, probably, not because it rang, but because it hadn't. It just was. People gathered to stare, poke, speculate. The priest said nothing, merely frowned and made a silent sign of the cross. The baker's wife swore the bell's surface changed when sunlight hit it. A child licked it once and said it tasted like honey and lightning. Ferrin wasn't there to see it, but the bell remembered him, because that's what it was made for. Far from the village, Ferrin walked. He followed no roads, carried no map, just the blade on his back, the heart forge cradled in a satchel, and the spiral etched gently into the inside of his wrist, burned there by the device the night before he left. He wasn't heading toward anyone. He was heading toward when, that's how the voices phrased it. You must bring the forge to when it's needed. He didn't understand, but he walked anyway. At sunset on the 5th day, he heard the bell. It rang once. Just one perfect, clear note. Though he was over 10 miles from the village, it struck like thunder through the trees, clean and mournful, like a farewell spoken in a language too old to grieve. He stopped mid-step, hand resting on the heart forge through the satchel's fabric. The bell had been struck, but not by hand, and not by wind. It had rung before anything touched it. Storm, the blade whispered, not weather, change. And so the bell, like the blade and the heart forge, was now remembering forward. Now, fun historical aside, in 1322, a church bell in the town of Wickham supposedly rang twice at midnight without anyone near it. A local chronicle said it was moved by air, not of this world. Historians still argue whether that account was a mistranslation or mass hallucination, but maybe, just maybe, it was a bell like Ferrin's, one that rang when time shifted. Ferrin arrived at a remote chapel 2 days later, crumbling stone, no roof, a skeleton of holy intentions left to the ivy, but the altar was intact, and upon it, a single item, a vial of mercury, sealed with lead and wax. The voice returned, calm now. This is the next alloy. He reached for the vial. The mercury sloshed like thought, slippery, elusive, reflective, but the wax around the stopper bore a mark he recognized, a spiral, reversed. He froze. What does that mean? A message not yet sent, one that echoes backward. Of course it did, because why not? He cracked the seal, poured a single drop of mercury into a depression on the heart forge's surface. The effect was immediate. The device exhaled. Not literally, but the air around it changed. Pressure shifted. Trees stilled. The silence grew deep and strange, like the moment before thunder breaks across a field. Then the Heart Forge spoke, not in a whisper, not in Ferrin's thoughts, but aloud. Warning, time not forming. Ferrin blinked. What? Causal overlap detected. Memory recursion approaching breach threshold. Speak plainly, he barked. You are being remembered before you are known. He staggered back. The mercury within the device shimmered, then resolved into an image, one he recognized immediately, the bell, hanging in the tower. But in the image, it was cracked, broken, and beneath it stood a figure, himself, older, wounded, speaking to a crowd whose faces were blurred. What is this? Ferrin whispered. A future echo, and then the image dissolved. He was left breathless, shaken. Is this what the guild sees? He asked. All of this? These echoes? Only glimpses. The forge shows what can be, what might be, not what will. He sat down hard on the stone steps, sweat cold on his spine. So, I've made a bell, he muttered, that can ring before it's struck, that can warn about time. The voice pulsed gently. A bell remembers its own ringing. He laughed, but it came out cracked. You're not helping. But the Heart Forge was already fading again, its glow dimming. The blade, too, fell silent. The forest resumed its breath. A squirrel chattered nearby, utterly unimpressed with this whole cosmic situation. Ferrin sighed and closed his eyes. Whatever he was becoming, it was more than blacksmith, more than alchemist. He was now a keeper of recursive memory, a steward of echoes that walked backward through time, and the bell, the strange, impossible bell, had rung before any of it had begun. He whispered, Who struck it? The answer came gently. You did, with your choice. He rose slowly, painfully aware that the forge wasn't just in his village anymore. It was wherever he stood, wherever time bent. He repacked the Heart Forge, gripped the memory blade, and took one more step forward. Behind him, the broken chapel whispered as it crumbled. The apothecary's vial was never meant to be melted. It had sat quietly in the village healer's cupboard for years, tucked behind rows of chamomile tinctures, beetroot ball, and the occasional questionable jar of badger fat. No one ever questioned its presence. It was old, yes, and the lead seal had cracked long ago, but the healer, a shrewd and shriveled man named Calder, simply shrugged and said it was ancestral. In truth, even he didn't know what it was for, until the night it screamed. It happened 3 days after the bell rang. The vial, never touched, never disturbed, let out a high-pitched wail, thin and sharp, like a child's cry inside a metal pipe. It cracked from top to bottom in an instant, the glass splitting not outward, but inward, as if something had collapsed inside it. Calder dropped the mortar in his hands and backed into the wall. The scream stopped, and in the silence, the wax seal began to melt. Not drip, melt, slowly and deliberately, like butter under a lens of sunlight. It pooled across the counter in a perfect spiral, searing into the wood like acid. Calder did the only sensible thing. He locked the shop and ran. Now, historians sometimes speak of alchemical relics, strange bottles or flasks, sealed centuries ago, and passed through generations with no known purpose. Some were filled with glowing salts, others were sealed with bones, but few ever activated, and fewer still left behind messages. When Ferrin returned to the village that night, he didn't knock on the healer's door. He didn't need to. The moment his boots touched the threshold, the forge within him whispered, "The vial has broken. The message is free." Calder cracked the door with shaking hands. "Smith Ferrin," he stammered. "It's doing something. I didn't mean to." Ferrin stepped inside and saw it immediately, the spiral, burned into the counter, still faintly warm. He traced it with his gloved finger, and the Heart Forge in his satchel answered, pulsing gently. He pulled it out and placed it near the mark. The spiral reversed. The blackened lines pulled inward, erasing themselves, and in their place rose tiny droplets of silver, quicksilver, like mercury, but suspended mid-air, orbiting each other like a miniature solar system. And within that spinning halo a voice, not his forge's voice, a new one, soft, feminine, Encoded carrier received. Iteration 3 successful. Listener Ferrin, do not trust the brass-masked one. He stiffened. What do you mean? The alloy is flawed. He speaks for containment, not continuity. He was not built to remember. Calder had backed into the far corner now, eyes wide, trembling behind his thick spectacles. I don't understand, Ferrin said. Built? Are you saying he's not? He is metal-shaped to hold mind. A vessel, like your heart forge, but empty. Purpose without soul. Ferrin thought back to the masked figure with the smooth silver face, the one who moved wrong, breathed wrong. Why did he come for me? Because you remember too clearly. The droplet spun faster now, collapsing into a single bead of silver that dropped into Ferrin's palm. It felt alive, cool and sharp, like thought condensed. Then the voice changed. Lower, urgent. He has made a second bell. Ferrin froze. What? A false ring. It draws listeners. It poisons memory. The bead began to burn his skin. He dropped it instinctively. It bounced once on the counter and evaporated. Gone. Calder cleared his throat carefully. What? What did that mean? Ferrin didn't answer right away. He picked up the cracked vial and turned it slowly in his hand. The lead seal was almost completely gone now, and beneath it, the glass bore a symbol he hadn't noticed before, a 7-pointed star, faint, faded, but unmistakable. He'd seen it once on a coin dropped by the merchant philosopher, and again on the gauntlet of the man in the woods, the mark of those who once listened and chose to forget. He turned to Calder. Did you ever use this vial? Calder shook his head. Too heavy, and I never knew what was inside. Ferrin stared at the remnants of the spiral on the counter. Memory, he murmured. Now here's your dreamy, dusty fact of the night. Medieval alchemists often debated whether memory was a physical force, something that could be stored like heat or compressed like steam. One fringe text, Devotibus Metallis, even claimed that silver remembers pain, gold remembers pride, and iron remembers war. Ferrin had just touched something that remembered him. That evening, Ferrin returned to his forge. It had remained untouched. The bell above the village had not rung again, yet something in the air felt tense, coiled, as though the village itself was waiting to hear. He set the heart forge on the bench, placed the cracked vial beside it, and unwrapped the sword. The blade shimmered as it always had, but now, as it lay beside the heart forge, both objects began to hum in unison, not loud, not urgent, just. Half-tuned, then the voice returned. Familiar this time, the next alloy is silence. Ferrin frowned. That's not metal. You're wrong. And the forge answered, not with heat, but with stillness. Everything stopped. No wind, no creaking wood, no ember pop, just pure, total quiet. It lasted for only a breath. But when it ended, the sword had changed. Slightly, a new vein ran down its center, dark as obsidian, cool to the touch. When he tapped it with a file, it made no sound. None. The sword had learned silence. He sat for hours, just watching it, and when he finally slept, he dreamed not of fire, or metal, or stars. He dreamed of bells, of 2 towers, one that rang before the storm, and one that rang long after it had passed, ringing, still. The soldiers arrived at dawn, not the kind with banners and trumpets. No pageantry, no silver-threaded tunics or polished boots. These men were quiet, dusty, their armor dulled intentionally, as if they feared their own reflections. 4 in total, led by a man who wore no uniform at all. Ferrin was at the bell tower when he saw them approach. They didn't head for the church or the town square. They came straight to the forge. By the time he returned, the village was already whispering. Soldiers, someone hissed, from the Baron's pass. Did someone die? No worse. Someone built something. It wasn't far from the truth. Ferrin stood at the edge of the workshop, arms crossed, sword wrapped and slung across his back. The lead soldier, though he didn't seem to care for the title, looked him over like a merchant assessing an oddly shaped potato. Smith Ferrin, he said, you are to come with us. Immediately. Ferrin didn't move. Under whose order? The Lord of Greystone. By writ of concern. Concern? Ferrin echoed. You've travelled 2 days for concern? The soldier narrowed his eyes. You've built objects that are not objects, created sounds from bells not yet struck, melted alloy that responds to breath and silence. My lord would like to discuss that. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers glanced at Ferrin's forge with unease. He was whispering to himself, not in prayer, in repetition. Ferrin's ears picked it up. Don't look in the coals, don't look in the coals. The heart forge, even boxed and hidden beneath the bench, was still speaking, but not to Ferrin, to them. He replied quietly, the forge doesn't take kindly to threats. The lead soldier snorted. We're not threatening, we're retrieving. That's when Ferrin saw it. On the man's belt, tucked into a sheath, designed not for a blade but for a rod. A rod of black iron, just like the masked figure from before. You've met the others, Ferrin said, carefully. The man looked surprised, but only for a moment. They warned us you'd be aware. Ferrin narrowed his eyes. Who are they? The man shrugged. Curators. Historians of a kind. Keepers of what should not spread, so it was true. The guild had opposition, and they were organized. Ferrin stepped aside. If I refuse, the soldier didn't smile. Then the forge burns, and anything within it is taken, melted, or buried. Your choice. That was enough. Ferrin reached behind the bench slowly and tapped to the edge of the box. Just once. The heart forge pulsed. Nothing explosive. Nothing dramatic. Just a single wave of pressure, silent but deep, like a breath held by the earth itself. The youngest soldier staggered back. The rod on the leader's belt rattled, and every horseshoe nail in the shop turned to point inward, toward him. The leader took a step back, now pale. You've been taught. No, Ferrin said calmly. I remembered. Then he stepped forward and tapped the floor with his boot, just above the hidden box. The forge roared to life. Flame burst from the chimney, even though no coal had been added. The metal fixtures on the walls glowed faintly with heat, but not heat of fire, heat of presence. Now, let's take a little historical detour, one worthy of bedtime shivers. There's a Welsh legend about a blacksmith whose forge fire would relight itself whenever a lie was spoken within the building. People eventually refused to speak in it at all, lest their secrets go up in smoke. Ferrin's forge had just declared truth, louder than any bell. The soldiers backed away, all except the leader. He reached for the rod, but froze, because the rod was melting. A slow, syrupy breakdown, like iron surrendering to its own reflection. It dripped onto the floor with a hiss that sounded almost disappointed, and then the whisper came, not from the forge this time, but from the very walls of the workshop. To be known is to be hunted. The soldiers fled. The leader, last. He said nothing, just stared at Ferrin, as though trying to memorize a riddle written in fire, and then he was gone. The village didn't ask questions, not openly, but they noticed the change. That night, no one went near the forge, not even to peek. The bell tower didn't chime. The tavern stayed quiet. Even the dogs stopped barking. But in the morning a basket of apples was left at Ferrin's doorstep. A gesture, not of fear, of respect. Ferrin stayed inside most of the day. He relit the forge slowly, pulled the heart forge from its box, set the memory blade beside it, and placed the cracked vial on the anvil. All the artifacts, all the echoes, all the warnings. He whispered aloud, "How many more will come?" The heart forge replied gently, "As many as must." Until all metal is either remembered or forgotten. Ferrin rubbed his eyes. He was tired, but not broken. That night he climbed the bell tower himself, sat beside the strange silent bell, and placed a single coin on the rim. One of the early ones, the ones that blinked, and he listened. Not to fire, not to steel, but to silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The soldiers did not return. But something else did. It came the next morning, as Ferrin hammered a curved plate for the village's mill gear. Just something simple, something normal. For once, the forge was quiet. The heart forge slept. The sword rested near the wall, wrapped in its cloth. Even the tools seemed docile. That peace lasted until the third strike of the hammer, because that's when the iron flexed. Not like a bend under pressure, not like a good curve formed by proper heat. It flexed back. Ferrin stepped away from the anvil slowly, the hammer still in his hand. The metal plate on the anvil, half-shaped, wavered like hot glass. Not from temperature, from intent. Then, as he stared, it coiled. The edges folded inward and twisted into a spiral, compressing into a shape that no blacksmith would ever design, and no human hand could hold. He touched it. It pulsed, and the whisper returned. Metal remembers wounds. The words didn't scare him anymore, but they did make him pause. What kind of wound? He asked. The shape shifted again. Lines formed on its surface. Grooves like the ones left by a blade scraping across armor, but not medieval, not from war. These were inside wounds, etched deep and fine, like the scar left by betrayal or grief or regret. Then a second whisper, not in his head, behind him, real, alive. Have you made armor that bleeds yet? Theron turned. No one. The forge was empty. Door still bolted. No sound from outside. And yet, he turned back to the metal and found it wasn't a plate anymore. It had become a shell, curved, ribbed, almost organic in its shape. He picked it up. It clung to his hand, not stuck, not hostile, just now connected, like it recognized him. And then it unfolded around his hand, a gauntlet, dark steel with a grain like wood, warm to the touch, light as leather. He flexed his fingers. The gauntlet responded perfectly, shifting with his movements. No joints, no seams, a perfect fit. And then it moved on its own. It reached toward the forge. Theron tried to pull back, reflex, but the gauntlet was ahead of him. His hand plunged into the coals, gripping a piece of glowing metal buried deep in the fire. And it didn't burn, he gasped. The metal he pulled from the fire was not iron. It was not copper. It was not anything. It was remembered. Now, I know you might be wondering how that's possible. That's fair. There's a fringe idea in metaphysical metallurgy, usually passed around alchemical circles long after midnight, that certain combinations of pressure, intent, and time could create metals that never existed, not discovered, created. Some texts refer to this as nullium, the unelement, drawn from the gap between understanding and purpose. Theron now held something like it in his hand. The moment it left the fire, it hardened. It didn't cool. It chose, and it spoke again, the same line. Metal remembers wounds. Then, new words, shape what cannot die. Theron didn't know what to forge, but his hands did. He worked for hours, maybe days. He lost count. The sun rose and fell behind clouds, and the world blurred beyond the forge walls. The whispers weren't words anymore. They were directions. The null metal formed around a frame he hadn't built, yet existed anyway. A suit, not plate armor, not chain, a second skin. When it was complete, it looked like a man carved from storm clouds. No visible clasps, no joints, just seamless plates flexing together, moving like breath. It stood on its own. Theron stared at it, hollowed out from the work, and then the final whisper came. Try it. He didn't argue. He stepped into the suit. It closed around him without resistance, not with force, with welcome. And in that moment, Theron saw everything. Not just through his own eyes, but through the metals. He saw every wound it had ever absorbed. A shield shattered at the gates of an ancient city. A chain rusted by the tears of a prisoner who whispered her son's name as she faded. A bell that cracked under the weight of too many last rites. A coin carried through 3 betrayals before melting in grief. And one nail, dropped in a stream by a boy who wanted his father's approval. All of it, carried here. Remembered, woven into this suit. And still, it was light. He walked in it like walking in breath, and then he heard a sound he hadn't expected. Applause, slow, sarcastic, familiar. A figure stepped from the corner of the forge. It was the merchant, the philosopher who had once warned him, now wearing a cloak burned at the edges, and eyes much older than before. You finally forged it, he said. Second skin. Theron didn't speak. I warned you, the man said. Told you the metal would remember too much. It remembers everything, Theron said. His voice echoed through the suit like a hymn in a cathedral. Yes, the merchant replied grimly. Even you. He stepped forward and placed something on the bench. A single, black coin, perfectly smooth. Theron stared. What is it? The man met his eyes, the first forgetting. Then he turned to leave. But before vanishing, he said, "You'll need to decide what's worth remembering and what you'll pay to forget." The forge pulsed again. Ferrin looked at the coin and knew the armor remembered wounds. But forgetting, that would cost more than steel. The forge was quiet, too quiet. Ferrin stood in the center of the workshop, the second skin armor folded neatly beside him, the black coin untouched on the bench. The heart forge no longer pulsed. The sword had gone dull, not rusted, just dim, like a candle, in full daylight. The whispers had ceased completely. The silence wasn't restful. It was hollow, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something has already happened and no one told you. He tapped the anvil once with a finger. No ring, not even a dull thud. Just nothing. "Why aren't you speaking?" he whispered. Not angrily, not desperately, just tired. No answer. He tried again, lit the forge, pumped the bellows, raised the temperature until the coals glowed like a sun trapped beneath stone. He even tried breathing across the flame, as he'd done before. Still, nothing. Not a whisper, not a hum, not even a breath of warmth from the heart forge. It was all silent. It was worse than before the voices began, because now he knew what he was missing. And here's a little wrinkle for you. There's an obscure 14th century manuscript, Vocatio Ferrum, that claims the only thing worse than hearing the language of metal is when it stops speaking. For the blacksmith, it reads, "will be left not with silence, but with the echo of his own unworthiness." Ferrin felt that in his bones. He tried working with his regular tools, made a gate hinge, repaired a bucket band, but the metal felt cold, unfamiliar, resentful somehow, like it didn't want him anymore. By the third day he stopped lighting the forge. By the fourth he sat alone, staring at the black coin. It hadn't moved since the merchant left it. Its surface remained flawless, as if no heat or memory had ever touched it. But now it whispered. Only one word. Forget. Ferrin shuddered. It wasn't the comforting, guiding voice he had come to know. It was flatter, clinical, the tone of a blade that didn't care who it cut. He picked the coin up. It felt cold. Not physically, but internally, like holding a lie that had just been believed. "Is that what you want?" he asked the forge, "to take it all back?" The heart forge didn't answer. The sword didn't move. He stared at the black coin, thumb brushing over its perfect edge, and for a moment he wanted it, to let go, to sleep in the quiet again, to wake up as just Ferrin the blacksmith, hammer in hand. No starlight dreams, no whispering bells, no time-bending armor, just metal, malleable, predictable, silent. But before he could move further, he heard something, not a whisper, a breath, behind him. He turned fast, heart jumping, but no one was there. Then he saw it. The nail, that nail, the one from the stream, the one he'd dropped as a child. Somehow, impossibly, it had reappeared, resting atop the heart forge. Not hot, not glowing, just present. He picked it up carefully, and the memory hit like a hammer. His father's hand on his shoulder, the feeling of loss over something so small, the way he had stared into the stream for what felt like hours, hoping it would float back to him. He sank to his knees. The black coin dropped from his hand and cracked, not into shards, not into dust, into ash. It had never been metal at all, just the idea of forgetting. And now that idea had broken. Ferrin pressed the nail gently to the surface of the heart forge. A faint glow, soft, tentative. Then, like a breath held too long, the forge sighed, and the whispers returned. Not loud, not many, just one. "We waited for your choice." He closed his eyes, trembling. "I didn't choose," he whispered. "But you refused. That is also choice." The armor began to hum faintly. The sword shimmered once more. The forge flickered. Ferrin exhaled, breath catching in his throat. "You left me," he murmured. "I thought I'd done something wrong. You needed to ask why you were listening. It made sense, and it didn't." That was the way of their answers. The silence wasn't punishment. It was the void left by doubt. He had doubted his worth, doubted the voices, doubted his own story. And in that gap, forgetting had crept in like a stray flame in dry straw. But now, Now he remembered what it felt like to choose to remember. He stood, the heart forge pulsed again. The sword rang once, clear as any bell, the armor flexed gently at the joints. He gathered them all, then went to the forge. He stoked the fire, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. The whisper came like a smile. "Welcome back, Ferrin." That night, the stars spun slower, or maybe they just seemed to. Either way, Ferrin watched them without speaking. He didn't need to, because for the first time in days, the metal was listening again, and it remembered him with joy. The forge fire danced brighter now, casting soft ribbons of orange and gold across the soot-stained walls. Ferrin stood in its glow, the heat licking at his sleeves, the smell of ash and oil settling deep in his bones like a familiar tune. But tonight, the forge was more than fire and iron. It was a chapel, and he was no longer just its smith. He was its listener, its speaker, its keeper. He laid the memory blade across the anvil, beside the freshly tuned heart forge. The second skin armor, folded neatly nearby, seemed to hum just faintly, content perhaps, like a hound resting after a long chase. For hours, he simply watched the fire, watched the tools, watched the way the light shimmered off the sword's edge, as though remembering every hand it had passed through before him. The whispers were quiet but constant now, a steady breath in the background of his thoughts. Not pressing, not demanding, just present. Until finally, a question floated up through the heat, soft and unfamiliar. "Are you ready to speak to us?" He didn't answer with words. He moved. He took bronze, iron, and a thread of silver from his hoard, each metal whispering faintly as he carried it to the crucible. They weren't words, more like tones, like echoes of something older than speech. "Shape us." So he did. He stirred the molten blend with reverence, the ladle heavier than usual, not from mass, but meaning. As he worked, the forge heat swelled, not oppressively, but deeply, like the breath of a slumbering giant. When he poured the alloy, it flowed like memory down the channel of the mold, a spiral of course, always a spiral. And when it cooled, he lifted a disc no wider than a locket, warm and pulsing in his palm. Not gold, not silver, not copper, a color that shimmered between them all, as if indecisive, as if it refused to be named. "This is the seal," the voice said. "A seal for what? For what comes next?" Ferrin ran a thumb over the disc. It tingled. Then, without thinking, he dipped the tip of a quill in ink and began writing. Not on parchment, on metal. The disc accepted it, drank the ink like wine, holding it fast as words flowed effortlessly from Ferrin's hand. Not Latin, not script, not anything he had learned, but something the forge remembered. When he was done, the seal vibrated once, then stilled. He blinked, his hand trembling slightly. "What have I written? A name. A name for what? For the wound you carry." That silenced him. He stared down at the disc. "I didn't mean to make this. No one ever does. That's how you know it's true." Ferrin looked toward the door. Rain had begun to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. He felt tired again, but not the hollow kind, not the ache of absence. This was the fatigue of bearing, of carrying something with care. He stood and placed the seal inside the hollow of the second skin armor's chest. It locked in perfectly, as though it had always waited for that space to exist. The armor shimmered, just once, then went still. The heart forge pulsed in response. "You are ready? For what?" Ferrin asked. To pass it on, that gave him pause. All of it. Not yet. But soon. A memory surfaced suddenly, his father at the forge, hunched over, humming a tune with no words. The rhythm of the hammer, the sigh of the bellows, the steady presence of doing, of shaping, of not knowing why, and doing it anyway. Ferrin closed his eyes. "What if I'm not meant to carry this forever?" he asked. The whisper returned gently. "You aren't." That was the first time the voice had given him relief, because all along he had assumed this burden was a lifelong pact, a sentence etched in molten iron. But now, it seemed, he was a chapter, not the book. He sat beside the fire, shoulders lowering, breath slowing, and the forge, as always, listened. As the rain thickened and midnight passed, He thought he heard a different sound, faint but certain, footsteps. Someone approaching the village forge. He didn't rise. He didn't draw the blade. He just listened. The steps stopped at the door. A knock, polite, hesitant. He opened the door. There stood a girl, no more than 16, soaked through from the rain but standing tall. She wore a travelling cloak, a satchel over one shoulder, and a pendant that glowed faintly beneath her collar. It was shaped like a spiral. "I'm looking for the man who hears metal speak," she said. Farron smiled softly. "You found him," he replied. But before she could speak again, he gestured her inside. "Come in," he said. "It's your turn to listen." And behind him, the forge crackled gently, welcoming her home. She sat in silence for a long time. Farron didn't press her. The girl she hadn't offered a name, and he hadn't asked, sat near the fire, legs tucked beneath her, the pendant resting just above her collarbone. It pulsed gently, dimming and brightening with the rhythm of her breath. The rain outside continued to whisper against the roof, a soft backdrop to the quiet crackle of the forge. She looked around the workshop as if trying to memorize it. "I thought it would be bigger," she finally said. Farron chuckled, low and warm. "Everyone does." They sat in silence again. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the bench and unwrapped it carefully. A hinge, ordinary at first glance. Wrought iron, just slightly corroded, the kind you might find on a door to a forgotten cellar. But etched into its surface, barely visible beneath the rust, was a familiar spiral. Farron leaned closer. "Where did you get that?" "My grandmother's house," she said, "buried in the wall, behind an old wooden board. No one ever noticed it was there." Farron picked it up. It was warm, not heated by touch, warm from within. As he held it, the whisper returned, not his usual voice, not the forge. A new one. "We hid there once. In silence, in fear." The words were heavy with dust and sorrow. The hinge trembled in his hand. Farron placed it beside the heart forge, which pulsed in response, slowly, as if in mourning. He looked at the girl. "Do you know what this is?" She nodded. "It's a piece of a door," she said, "but not to a house." That made Farron's breath hitch, because he understood. She wasn't just a seeker. She was a remembered, already partially tuned. She had been called, just like him. "Do the whispers come to you in dreams?" he asked. "They used to," she said. Then they started coming in water, reflections, ripples. Farron blinked. That was new. The forge hummed gently behind them, not correcting, not objecting, just listening. She stood and approached the heart forge. The pendant around her neck pulsed brighter. She touched the metal gently. A soft ring answered, low, familiar. The same note the memory blade had sung the day it was finished. The forge surged slightly, flame-shifting blue at its edges. Farron felt it in his ribs, like hearing a story that had already ended, but somehow continued anyway. "I think," the girl whispered, "I'm supposed to find the rest of the door." He swallowed. "Then you'll need protection." She turned to him, brow raised. "A weapon?" "No," he said. "A memory." He reached beneath the bench and lifted the second skin armor. Her eyes widened as he unwrapped it. It shimmered in the firelight like dark water, still flexible, still breathing. She stepped forward, almost reverently. "This was yours?" "No," he said. "It was mine to carry, but it was never meant to stay." He placed it before her gently, like an offering. "The metal remembers pain," he said. "It holds grief. It keeps wounds that may one day protect you or bind you." She nodded, then said something unexpected. "I'm not afraid of remembering." Farron smiled softly. "Then you're ready." She didn't try the armor on, not yet. But she placed her hand over the chest plate, where the seal pulsed gently, and closed her eyes. For a moment the forge was silent. Then slowly it whispered, not just to her, to both of them. Two now, one new, one fading. Farron stepped back. The girl turned to him. "You're leaving," she said. Not a question. He nodded. "There's somewhere I need to go." "Where?" "To the place where the metal first learned to speak." She didn't ask how he knew where that was. She didn't need to, because they both felt it now. An unspoken direction, not bound to maps or stars. Will I hear the voices when you're gone? She asked. He smiled. They'll be louder. She hesitated. Then what if I don't understand them? He reached out and gently tapped the anvil. It rang softly. True. They'll wait for you. She breathed in deeply, then turned back to the armor, and for the first time it moved. Not much, just a subtle bend, like a nod, like it recognized her. That night, Ferrin packed lightly. Just the memory blade. The heart forge remained behind. He watched the forge flame one last time, letting the warmth soak into his skin. Then he crossed to the bell tower. It hadn't rung since the day of the soldiers, but now, in the quiet of a starlit night, it hummed. He placed a hand against its cool bronze surface. "Thank you," he whispered. No answer came, but in his heart he felt the bell waiting. At dawn, he stepped out into the pale light. The girl stood beside the forge door, watching him go. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Ferrin nodded once, then walked toward the hills, toward the place where memory had begun. And behind him, for the first time, the forge whispered not to him, but to her. The path took Ferrin farther than he expected. Beyond the rivers where he once hunted frogs as a child. Beyond the high ridges where the traveling peddlers traded tin charms and broken lutes. Even past the old stone boundary marker, weathered and cracked, where the villagers whispered the world ended, or at least where sense did. But the forge's whisper was clear now. It didn't speak constantly. Only when he wavered, when doubt crept in like a draft through a warped doorframe, the voice would stir. You are going the right way. By the third day, the hills grew stranger. The birds flew in quiet, spiral flocks. The trees leaned not toward the sun, but toward each other, as though huddled in conference. And the stones, rounded and metallic underfoot, hummed faintly when stepped upon, as if acknowledging their own shape. Ferrin no longer questioned these things. He had learned to accept the impossible like morning bread. On the fourth evening he found it. The forge, or what remained of it. It wasn't a building, not anymore. Just a hollow depression in the ground, ringed with glass-smooth stone. In the center lay a mass of solid iron, as wide as a wagon wheel, and flat like a mirror. No tools, no ash, no chimney, but heat still rose from it. Not heat of flame, heat of intention. He knelt beside it, unslung the memory blade, and laid it gently across the surface. The blade vibrated once. A tone rang out, not high, not low, just true. Ferrin whispered, "Is this where it began?" The voice answered, not from the forge, not from the sword, but from the air around him. Before words, before fire, yes. He closed his eyes and saw, not through memory, but through metal. He saw hands, many hands, shaping a glowing orb of raw molten sky. He saw tools before tools, soundless hammering, fire with no smoke, creation with no destruction, and in every gesture, a spiral worn into bone, etched in dust, branded into stars. Then came the forgetting. He watched it happen. A war not of armies, but of ideas. Some wanted the metal to remember, others wanted it to obey. The voices split. Some silenced themselves, others echoed forward, and one fragment, small, burning, fell to earth, and became the first forge, the one Ferrin now knelt beside. He opened his eyes. His palms were slick with sweat. The memory blade still vibrated faintly, but now it pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Then the forge spoke again. "You brought it home. What did I bring?" he asked, barely audible. The memory of choice. He looked up at the sky. The stars were already emerging, blinking through the dusk like curious eyes. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you listened, not just to us, to yourself." He felt the tears come, not many, just enough. Then he rose and did the only thing he could. He placed the sword in the forge's center. It melted. Not with pain, with release. The blade unraveled like silk in firelight, unwinding into liquid strands that curled and merged into the surface of the forge. The spiral was complete again. Ferrin watched it until the glow faded. Then he whispered, "I'm not a blacksmith anymore." The voice replied gently, "No, you're something older. Back in the village the girl worked." She learned quickly. The forge answered her with joy. the heart forge spinning its core when she sang old lullabies she didn't know she knew. The armor had adjusted to her shape. It moved now, not like clothing, but like resolve. And one night she heard a bell, not the village bell, a deeper one, a tone that came from under the forge floor. She followed it and found a box. Inside, one object, a tiny iron nail, wrapped in cloth, with a note written in firm, familiar script. For when you doubt, F. She smiled. Far away, Ferren stood on the high ridge, staring down at the land below. The wind tugged gently at his cloak. The forge within him was quiet now, not gone, just settled. The kind of quiet that comes after a song has ended, and you know the next one will begin. But for now, silence is the only sacred thing. He whispered one last thing into the wind. Remember her, the wind replied, always. And so Ferren walked on toward nothing in particular. But the metal? The metal remembered everything. The forge now, under the girl's care, took on a different rhythm. Not better, not worse, just new. She didn't try to replace Ferren. She couldn't. His shape was still there, in the soot-blackened stones, in the worn grips of the tongs, in the faint curve of the doorframe where his shoulder had leaned too many times to count. But the forge accepted her, not because she mimicked him, but because she didn't. She listened differently. Where Ferren heard in fire and ringing steel, she heard in ripples and reflections. The basin of quenching water became her compass. She could place a newly drawn nail in the bath, watch the way it disturbed the surface, and know if it was true. The whispers began teaching her as they had him, but this time they came with questions. Why shape this? Why fold here? She didn't always answer aloud, but she answered. The forge was asking not just for memory anymore, it was asking for judgment, because the voice that had guided Ferren had evolved, split, spread, adapted. The forge was no longer simply a whisper, it had become a dialogue, and the girl, her name was Morel, though she rarely said it aloud, had begun to teach back. She built things Ferren never had. A set of tuning keys for a door that hadn't been found yet, a hammer that struck without sound, a set of mirrored braces that shimmered only when someone lied near them. She didn't need to understand them. She simply knew when they were done, and then came the traveller. A boy this time, maybe 12, cheeks smudged with charcoal, a map scratched into the back of a kitchen tray. He knocked 3 times on the door. Morel answered with a smirk. "You've come to listen," she said, before he could speak. He blinked. "How did you?" She just tilted her head. "You brought iron, didn't you?" The boy nodded, pulling out a piece of bent railing. "It hums." "Good," she said. "That's how it starts." She welcomed him in. She showed him the forge. She gave him the hammer. Meanwhile, far away, so far, no map could chart it. Ferren stood beneath a tree that had never grown in soil. It shimmered slightly, every leaf vibrating with tones too ancient for ears. Beside him, a pool that didn't reflect the sky, but moments. In its surface he watched, Morel placing a sealed scroll into a locked box beneath the forge. The boy hammering his first nail, sweat pouring down his brow. A bell, ringing gently in a city that did not yet exist. A metal mask crumbling to dust beneath a rising sun. The memory of the forge had unfolded like a map across time. Ferren whispered, "Is it enough?" The wind answered,